Fox News learning now the White House is apparently circulating a memo, an executive memo, with a focus on Google to start things off. Our Jillian Turner has more. Jillian.
Hi, Neil. Fox News has learned the White House is circulating a draft executive order known as an EO that calls for better policing of the major online platforms. That includes Google, Facebook, and Amazon. According to multiple sources who have seen the document, the platforms aren't named specifically in the order, and it's also unclear when or if the White House will actually issue the order officially. The draft, as of now, is written in two parts. The first section's a policy statement that says platforms are central to the flow of information and commerce and need to be held accountable through competition. The second part of the order instructs federal departments and agencies across the government to enforce against anti-competitive conduct when they have authority, and when they don't, to report concerns or issues they have to the Federal Trade Commission and the Justice Department. This draft order comes, Neil, as the FTC plans to host a series of hearings looking at antitrust and consumer protection enforcement, and also considers whether it should be more aggressive. It also comes as lawmakers express increasing public concern about the tech sector generally. President Trump himself accused Google just last month via Twitter of prioritizing stories from CNN and other left-wing media over conservative news outlets. Neil?
All right, Jillian, thank you very much. The read on all this and the fallout from this, John Layfield, we've got Dan Geltrude, and back with us as well, Susan Lee. Dan, what do you think?
I don't like it, Neil. I don't like it. I think we're going down a slippery slope if we're going to get the government involved in policing what search engines are doing. I mean, where does it end now? I think we go into no man's land. I think the government will be extremely ineffective if they try to take this on. Listen, let the market decide. If people don't like how these search engines and social media companies are conducting themselves, don't use them. Don't get involved with them.
Easier said than done, right, Susan? With Google, when you have 90% of the search market, or whatever you want to call it, it's not as if it's that easy to do,
spigots.
Right?
Yeah, so 1.8 billion people visit YouTube each month. They control 75% of the advertising market, and they spend the most on Washington lobbying each year, $18 million. But I think the markets have kind of priced this in. If you look at the underperformance of the NASDAQ, which is tech heavy, and the money that's come out of Google shares and Facebook and all the other social media online platforms, it shows you that the market and investors do think there is tighter regulation to come at some point.
Or there might be a dissatisfaction with the bias that they deem a lot of these social media companies have. Not Google's not a social media per se, I understand. But Google's CEO and chief financial officer have come out over the last week or two acknowledging mistakes where there is a bias and correcting employees. Be careful of that bias. But what do you think?
I think the same thing with Jack Dorsey and Twitter. He acknowledged that his employee workforce is overwhelmingly liberal.
But then you got to do something about it.
But he says it doesn't affect his work. And as Google says, they haven't implemented any of these bias that they have, even though they may have political bias personally.
But what if it's built into their algorithms?
I think the market's going to take over. I agree with Dan. I mean, aren't the Republicans the free market, free speech guys? I don't think government should get into this at all. This is one of the backbones of our economy right now. And for government to step in, government has not done anything well when they've regulated things. And that's one of the reasons the internet has done so well. Government needs to stay out of this, in my opinion.
You know, Dan, what if they're just doing this for the effect? That is, the White House might be, you better clean up your act or we'll clean it up for you. And the threat alone, like trade, is good enough.
That's certainly possible. I think the president here is using this story to say, I was right. There is absolutely people out there against me, against Republicans, against conservatives. They're rigging the system. All these things are happening. He gets some credibility here. But you know what, Neil? Google, in this particular case, has said, okay, these conversations, these emails did happen. Those were personal views. However, the algorithms have not been impacted by this. But you know what I say? Google needs to do a little bit more than just a warning. Fire some people. Make it very clear you could have your own opinions, but Google must stay neutral. And that's going to be our culture.
What do you think?
Well, I was looking at Google. Do you value it as a public utility? Because we have had precedents where utilities have been broken up under Republican administrations, like AT&T. Either you take a look at it in the 1960s, or eventually it was broken up in the 1980s. When you control so much of the market as Google does, I mean, 70% of the traffic flow through either Facebook or Google. I mean, if that's not a utility and market monopoly, what is?
Well, could I ask, this is a dumb question, but if Google is a search engine, right, and you try to type in articles or get information on, let's say, presidents and their State of the Union addresses, this is one of the areas where President Trump had a beef, and you get all this praise and stuff from Obama speeches, let's say, and fewer for Donald Trump, wouldn't that reflect the mainstream media search that's included here, which tends to be left-leaning anyway, and wouldn't be a Google issue as much as a recognition that mainstream media, the traditional media we use, is indeed biased to the left?
I think you're right, and I think your point about the president using this as pressure, to me, I think that could be enough, and that may be what the president is doing with his Twitter account. I think it's very intelligent if that's what he's doing, that he's going to put pressure on these guys, because just like today, we're putting a lot of pressure on Google to not be biased, and they're going to come out, and I think the pendulum's going to swing the other way. I think they're going to come out as some type of more conservative tendencies just to show that they're not biased.
Where does it go, though? I mean, you just worry about government interference, period, right? You think they screwed up enough they shouldn't be dabbling in what's going on and what's working, right?
I think so, Neil. Look, can we really be sure that the government can get involved in something like this, policing the internet and being effective? There are far smaller projects they're taking on that are getting messed up. This is like a behemoth to try to take on. I just don't think
Why
that they
don't you
can
extend
do it.
that to then when the president demands companies manufacture more in the United States or hire more in the United States?
Listen, I don't necessarily think that the president is right by doing that either. I mean, if you're going to be a free market guy, then let companies and countries compete against each other. Not to go off topic, but that relates to the whole tariff issue. The president wants a level playing field, then let's have a level playing field. If it's better for companies to manufacture in China or someplace else,
But that's not what he's saying. So laissez-faire should be laissez-faire consistently, right?
he should be consistent. Absolutely.
And I would argue also that the U.S. economy getting to this stage has been largely built on a lot of these technology companies and the money that they've made and the business that they've brought in. So I would agree. I'm not saying I'm a free market person myself. I'm not saying that we should regulate them, but I think that there should be checks and balances when you hold such a large portion of the market and you have so much control, right, over the information flow and the competitive nature of what's happening on the internet.
But I will agree with something Dan said. I mean, remember when they hold all the banking executives before them last year? And I'm thinking they're preaching to these guys about how they squander their money. And I'm thinking it'd be like me pointing the finger, but you really should eat that salad. I'm not the guy to recommend it, and they're not the guys to preach. So I do see what Dan is saying, but I wonder where this goes.
It's like the Dodd-Frank. Dodd and Frank were over the banking sector before the crisis. Then they're the ones that said they're going to fix it afterwards. They didn't see it coming. The government is not very good about regulating stuff, and who's going to regulate the government?
Good point.
If you're either free market people or you're not.
Well said. I wouldn't argue with him because
I wouldn't argue.
I might chance it, but
It's your birthday. You can't if you
I'll
want
let
to.
it go. All right, guys, thank you.